In this episode, we move into one of the most sensitive areas in artificial intelligence, AI governance, and that is the use of biometric information. New learners often hear the word biometrics and think first about convenience, like unlocking a phone with a face or a fingerprint, but the governance story is much bigger than convenience. When AI uses a face, a voice, an iris pattern, a fingerprint, a gait pattern, or another human characteristic to recognize, compare, classify, or track people, the organization is no longer dealing with ordinary information alone. It is dealing with information tied directly to human bodies and human identity, and that changes the level of care required. The reason this matters so much is simple. If an organization mishandles a password, the password can be changed. If it mishandles biometric information, the consequences can be far harder to contain because the person cannot simply replace their face, voice, or fingerprints and move on as if nothing happened. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to start is by defining what biometric information really is. Biometric data is information derived from physical or behavioral traits that can be used to recognize, compare, or distinguish one person from another, or in some cases to infer things about them. That can include facial geometry, voice prints, fingerprints, palm patterns, iris scans, gait patterns, keystroke rhythms, and other measurable patterns tied to the way a person looks or acts. What makes biometrics different from an ordinary photograph or audio file is not only the format of the file itself, but the purpose and processing behind it. A simple image of a crowd is not automatically being used as biometric data in the same way a system uses facial features to match one person against a database. This distinction matters because governance has to focus on what the system is actually doing with the human trait, not only on the fact that a camera, microphone, or scanner happened to capture something involving a person. From there, it becomes easier to understand why biometric information is so often treated as sensitive and, in many governance and legal frameworks, specially protected. Sensitive or special category data usually refers to information that deserves heightened care because misuse could expose people to discrimination, surveillance, coercion, stigma, identity harm, or serious intrusions into autonomy and dignity. Biometrics often falls into that zone because it can identify a person uniquely, connect activity across time and place, and sometimes reveal or suggest other intimate facts beyond identity alone. A face scan may be used for authentication, but it can also become part of broader tracking or profiling when combined with location, behavior, or account data. A voice sample may help confirm a caller's identity, yet it may also expose accent, emotional state, or health-related traits that go beyond the original purpose. Once learners understand that biometrics can sit at the intersection of identity, monitoring, and inference, the need for heightened protection starts to sound much less like bureaucracy and much more like basic respect for human vulnerability. One reason biometrics demands special caution is permanence. Many kinds of data are sensitive, but biometric traits often feel uniquely personal because they are closely tied to the body and are difficult or impossible to replace. If a username leaks, it can be changed. If a payment card is compromised, it can often be canceled and reissued. If a facial template or a voice model is exposed, the person may face a much longer problem because their own body remains the reference point the system was built around. That creates a very different kind of risk calculation for organizations. It means leaders should think not only about ordinary confidentiality, but also about the long life of the data, the difficulty of recovery after exposure, and the possibility that one compromise could affect a person across multiple services or contexts. Biometric misuse can therefore feel more intimate and more lasting than many other data problems, which is exactly why protection standards should rise before the system goes live rather than after something has already gone wrong. Another important idea for beginners is that not every biometric use is equally risky, and strong governance depends on understanding the purpose of the use. A system that confirms whether one employee can access one secure area is not automatically the same as a system that identifies strangers in a public space, analyzes emotions during an interview, or tracks movement patterns across a workplace or a city. Some uses are about one-to-one verification, where a person claims an identity and the system checks whether the biometric sample matches the record tied to that identity. Other uses are about one-to-many identification, where the system tries to discover who someone is by comparing them against a much larger collection. Still, other uses go beyond identity and try to classify, predict, or infer things about a person based on bodily or behavioral signals. Governance gets much stronger when organizations stop treating biometrics as one single category and instead ask what exact function the AI system is performing, why that function is needed, and how much risk the specific use creates for the people involved. That purpose question leads directly into data minimization, which becomes especially important when biometrics enters the picture. A responsible organization should not begin by asking how much biometric information it can collect. It should begin by asking whether biometric information is truly necessary at all for the task it wants to perform. If the same outcome can be achieved through a less intrusive method, that alternative deserves serious attention. Even when biometrics seems justified, the organization should still narrow the use by deciding what exact trait is needed, what level of detail is required, and whether the system can work without retaining raw images, raw audio, or other rich source material longer than necessary. Many privacy and governance failures begin when teams gather broad biometric inputs just because the technology allows it, then only later try to figure out how to control what they collected. Stronger practice reverses that order. It limits the intake at the beginning so the system is not built on the assumption that every measurable human trait is fair game simply because the model can process it. Storage and retention deserve the same level of discipline. One of the most practical protections is to avoid keeping more biometric material than the system actually needs for longer than the purpose actually requires. In many cases, an organization may not need to retain raw images, raw audio, or raw scan data once a more limited representation has been created for a narrow purpose. Even then, the smaller representation still deserves careful handling because reducing the format of the data does not remove the seriousness of the risk. A biometric template may be more constrained than a full image, but it still carries identity consequences if mishandled, matched improperly, or linked to other data sources without control. Retention periods, therefore, should not be based on convenience alone. They should be tied to a clear operational need, supported by deletion rules, and revisited when the system or the business purpose changes. The safer design is usually the one that keeps biometric material in the smallest useful form, under the narrowest practical access, for the shortest defensible period of time. Access control becomes even more important once biometric systems are live, because a well-designed collection rule can still fail if too many people can see, export, reuse, or combine the data later. Organizations should not assume that because a team works on identity, security, or analytics, every member of that team automatically needs broad visibility into biometric data. Different people usually need different levels of access, and many only need limited views connected to their function rather than unrestricted availability of the full material. This matters because biometric data becomes more dangerous when it can move quietly between systems, departments, or vendors without a clear boundary. A support team may need one kind of access, an auditor another, and a technical maintainer another, yet all of them should be constrained by the principle that access follows real necessity, not curiosity or convenience. Third-party involvement raises the stakes even further. If a vendor hosts, analyzes, or stores biometric data, the organization should know exactly what that vendor may do with it, how it is protected, how long it remains, and whether it can be reused for any purpose outside the approved service. Accuracy and fairness are also central when AI uses biometrics, because a system can be highly sensitive and still be treated carelessly if the organization focuses only on technical novelty. A biometric tool that performs unevenly across populations can create serious harm even when its overall accuracy sounds strong in marketing language. Misidentification, false matches, missed matches, unequal error rates, or inconsistent performance across age groups disabilities, skin tones, voices, accents, or environmental conditions can all translate into real-world consequences. A door may stay locked for one group more often than another. A fraud review may escalate some customers unfairly. A face-based screening process may burden one population more heavily even if the average performance sounds acceptable. For that reason, organizations should not treat biometric AI as neutral just because it appears mathematical. Systems must be tested in conditions that reflect real use, and higher-stakes applications should include meaningful human review and escalation paths so people are not trapped by the output of a system that cannot see them clearly or treat them consistently. Notice, transparency, and meaningful alternatives matter as well, because people deserve to understand when biometric systems are being used and what that use means for them. A weak notice might simply mention security, innovation, or automation in broad language that tells people very little at the moment the biometric system actually affects them. Stronger practice helps a person understand whether the system is identifying them, authenticating them, monitoring them, or inferring characteristics about them from bodily or behavioral signals. In some contexts, the organization should also think carefully about whether a person can reasonably choose another path. A biometric requirement can become coercive if the only realistic way to access a service, workplace function, or important opportunity is to surrender a bodily identifier to an AI system. Governance is much stronger when teams ask whether a genuine alternative exists, whether the explanation is understandable, and whether the person affected can meaningfully question or challenge the use. Transparency is not just about disclosure. It is about helping people understand the role of the system well enough that they are not dragged into a highly sensitive form of processing without clear expectations. Function creep is one of the biggest long-term risks in this area, and beginners should learn to recognize it early. A biometric system often begins with a narrow stated purpose, such as access control, attendance, account recovery, or fraud prevention, and later drifts into broader monitoring, profiling, or analytics because the data is already there and the technology appears capable of doing more. A face used to open a device becomes a face used to track movement. A voice sample used for authentication becomes a voice sample mined for emotion, stress, or behavioral scoring. A gate pattern used for security becomes a pattern tied to productivity, discipline, or suspicion. This drift can happen quietly because each step feels like a small expansion rather than a new system altogether. Good governance fights that tendency by requiring fresh review whenever biometric data is proposed for a new purpose, a new audience, a new environment, or a more influential role in decision-making. If that review does not happen, a narrow biometric use can slowly become an open-ended surveillance or inference system without anyone making a fully conscious decision to build one. Incident response and recovery deserve special attention because biometric data breaches are not just ordinary database events. When an organization loses control of biometric data, the damage can be difficult to reverse, and the response must reflect that reality. The organization should know how to detect exposure, how to contain access, how to notify the right parties, how to investigate whether the data moved further than expected, and how to reassess the continued use of the system afterward. It also needs to think honestly about the limits of remediation. People cannot simply reset their bodies the way they reset a password, which means breach planning cannot rely on the same assumptions used for more replaceable credentials. Incident response around biometrics should therefore include not only technical containment, but also governance questions about whether the purpose remains justifiable, whether data volumes were too large, whether retention was too long, and whether the system should be narrowed, redesigned, or retired altogether. Real protection means planning for failure before it happens, especially when the data involved is so difficult for the individual to recover from later. Organizational governance is what holds all of these protections together. A biometric AI system should not appear in the environment simply because one team found a useful vendor or one manager liked a product demonstration. The organization needs clear ownership, review pathways, training, and policy expectations tailored to the seriousness of the data involved. Business leaders should understand why biometrics is not just another data stream. Privacy, security, legal, and risk teams should know when biometric use triggers heightened scrutiny. Technical teams should understand the difference between a narrow, justified biometric function and a broader inference system that may need a very different governance response. Everyday users should know what they are allowed to do, what data they should never enter or export, and how to escalate concerns if the system begins to drift beyond its approved role. When governance is weak, biometric tools tend to spread through convenience and novelty. When governance is strong, the organization asks hard questions early enough that many harmful uses never become normal in the first place. As you finish this lesson, keep one main idea in mind. Protecting biometric data in AI systems is not only about locking down a database or adding a policy warning after deployment. It is about recognizing that biometric information is deeply tied to identity, dignity, and human vulnerability, and that many frameworks treat it with heightened sensitivity for good reason. Responsible organizations narrow the purpose, minimize the collection, limit the retention, control the access, test the system carefully, explain the use honestly, resist function creep, and prepare for the reality that a biometric breach can be much harder to repair than other data incidents. Once you see biometrics through that lens, the governance standard becomes much clearer. The organization is not just managing another feature. It is managing a form of data that touches the body, the person, and the possibility of long-term harm if it is used carelessly. That is why biometric AI deserves some of the strongest protection in the entire governance program.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.